Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to our talk. It is my privilege to introduce Professor Michael Howlett of NU School of Public Policy, who has kindly agreed to give us a talk on dealing with failure over the long term, policy synchronization, adaptive policy design. Professor Michael Howlett also held appointment at Simon Fraser University in Canada, and he is now at NU School of Public Policy.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I wanted to thank Dean Collins and Professor Howie for the invitation to speak to you today, and generally to NNU for being a very gracious host and showing me the campus and some of the new programs, which are very, of course, exciting and innovative. This is a talk which has a little bit of a history in terms of how it developed, and I'll just basically sort of walk you through the slides eventually, but let me just tell you a little bit about that at the beginning. It grows out of some work that I've been doing with some colleagues at the LKY school, which has been focused on policy design issues, and especially on policy failure. And we've had a series of conferences and workshops looking at those issues, trying to get a better sense of what sort of good design is, what distinguishes design from non-design, what the contextual factors are of design, what the policy work process is, the analytical processes are that are involved in policy design, and also, of course, thinking of sort of better designs designed to overcome policy failures or limitations. And so that's got us into a variety of other work dealing with governance arrangements and issues, policy learning, emulation, evaluation, activities like that. We've had a series of these conferences, and the next one that we'll be having, the call for papers will actually go out tomorrow, so I just got it today in my email box. It'll be in Chengdu in China, and the theme of that one is really dealing with policy agility. And some of you may have already run into that term in some work that's been done in the OECD and in other places dealing with agility. And the idea, of course, behind that is about having governments which have not only a fairly high level of policy capacity and competences and capability, but which is also able to exercise those in an intelligent and fairly quick manner to respond to different kinds of problems. In dealing with policy agility, one of the issues, of course, has to do with policy failures, and especially the kinds of failures that exist and how they can be overcome. And one of the issues which has come up over and over again in the various conferences and workshops that we've had is about the role of knowledge and the role of information in these processes, and especially in dealing with some of the kind of fundamental, almost metaphysical characteristics of the policy processes and policy environments and contexts, dealing with information and knowledge, specifically in dealing with problems of uncertainty and ambiguity. What this paper is about and what the conference is about is a sort of policy agility, dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty. And that's really what this paper is about. The term that we're using here, which is policy synchronization, is trying to get at a problem that exists with certainty and with a lack of ambiguity or with precision in dealing especially with a class of policy problems that occurs over the long term, in which there are difficulties in keeping policy design synchronized with shifts in the environment. So the idea is that one of the problems of uncertainty and one of the problems of ambiguity that policymakers are dealing with constantly, and by policymakers I mean not just political decision makers but also analysts and other experts in government, is with trying to keep policy synchronized with changes that are happening in their environment. So part of being an agile government is part of designing policies and designing policy processes which enable this synchronization to occur. So rather than getting locked in to specific policies at a particular point in time, which are very difficult to change, that there should be some process of adaptive policy making or reflexive policy making which builds this agility or adaptiveness right into the policy right from the start. So the paper really discusses a little bit about what uncertainty is, how uncertainty is different from ambiguity. It develops a concept of deep uncertainty that some of you may know from the work of mainly Dutch scholars like Warren Walker and others at Twente and Delft in the Netherlands. And it applies some of that thinking to policymaking and to the policymaking context, identifying this class of issues or this class of problems that has these long-term characteristics and these characteristics of sort of asynchronization or the possibility of falling out of synchronicity, I guess, with the context it's involved in. And it says something about, or it looks a little bit at the literature which suggests how policies can be made to be more adaptive or reflexive, and not just how the policies can be made to be more adaptive or reflexive, but also how the policy-making processes have to be adaptive and reflexive. So I'll just sort of go through some of these. I should mention, of course, that I have a co-author on this, who is Srijan Nair, who's a PhD student at the LKY school, who's working on her PhD thesis in the area, primarily looking at cases from India. But this particular paper doesn't have a sort of strong empirical basis. It's more of a conceptual, sort of theoretical discussion or elaboration. What she's really doing in her thesis is applying some of this to the cases that she's looking at, mainly in the agro-environmental area in 3 Indian states. Okay. So as I said, I'll just sort of walk through these, and please, feel free to interrupt me with any questions that you might have. I imagine this will take about 45 minutes or so, and then I understand we can go till about 12:30, so there should be plenty of time for questions afterwards, but please interrupt me if you'd like any clarification at any point. So what the paper, as I say, is about is how policies develop to deal with specific problems or issues, if they're left in place for a long enough time, are highly likely to fail. And this was one of the conclusions that we drew from the policy failures workshop that we had, which was, in addition to having some difficulties in defining a policy failure, which I think, thanks to the work of Alan McConnell and others, we have a little bit more insight into that recently. There is a sense that although people would like to avoid policy failures, that to a certain extent they're inevitable. So if you were just to put a policy in place and leave it over a long period of time, it is virtually inevitable that it will fail at some point. And I think all of us can think of examples of where that's occurred in a number of different jurisdictions. So one of the problems in policy making and in developing more successful policies is, of course, not leaving policies in place for long periods of time so that they will inevitably fail, but trying to do something either at the start of the policy process or later on as the process unfolds, which will allow policies to shift or have enough flexibility or agility to be able to deal with changing circumstances. There is a bit of literature on this, and some of you are probably familiar with some of the better-known works like Baumgartner and Jones's work on policy bubbles and overreactions and so on, which is really talking about this same process. And also some colleagues from the LKY school now in New York, Raul Lejano and his colleagues, who've also looked at the same problem and have noted the sort of distinction and juxtaposition of content and context, and the need to ensure that the content continually matches the context as the context of policy changes over time. A lot of that literature, as I mentioned, deals with issues about risk and uncertainty and the different kinds of uncertainty that policymakers face in the process of initially developing policies and then also ensuring that this synchronicity occurs or continues to occur over time once the policy has been put into place. I mentioned Warren Walker's work. Walker has developed this idea of deep uncertainty, which other people talk about as ambiguity, and I'll sort of hopefully highlight some of the advantages of thinking about this as deep uncertainty rather than as ambiguity, and a lot of what's in the paper draws on this work. Okay, not surprisingly, as everybody knows, who looks at the subject for more than 5 minutes anyway, is that policymaking is not a simple subject, a difficult thing to do, very complex processes that are at work, multiple actors, multiple jurisdictions, international domestic issues, multi-level governance issues, a whole variety of contextual factors that make policymaking difficult. As a result, it's not surprising that many policies, of course, fail. And politicians and decision makers, of course, have to take that into account. In especially democratic systems, the punishment for failure on the part of voters is very often very quick. It's very difficult to make excuses during an election campaign and so on. So the punishment can be quite harsh, which is that whoever was responsible for the failure, if the failure is big enough, if it's a politically or electorally salient issue, can lose the ability to make policies, i.e. can be voted out of government or lose power and authority within government itself. So not surprisingly, many governments and many decision makers are extremely risk averse. Right? This is one of the issues which has come up in a variety of areas recently, like climate change, for instance, where if you look at a number of the major journals that are dealing with issues of climate change, like global environmental change or global environmental politics and the like, they're often dealing with questions like, why is there not innovation in order to deal with climate change? And some of that can be attributed to this risk-averse behavior on the part of decision makers, because innovation is very risky. Right? Innovations may not work, and the punishment for failures may be quite prompt and fairly decisive for them. So in circumstances like this and in policymaking generally, it's important to be able to sort of accurately evaluate and assess the risks of failure and, of course, the causes of failure. And it's important to ensure that a policy will deal with a particular problem, not just in the short term, but also in the medium term and in the long term. But once you get beyond the short term and you get into the medium and the long term, then of course you have a problem of the potential and the possibility for changes in the context of policy making, whereby if the content remains the same, it may fall out of synchronization with the context, with the shifts in the context. So there is an interest on the part of many, including those in government and outside in academia, to better understand these issues, right? To better understand failure, to better understand the nature of risk, to better understand the differences between short and long-term policymaking, to better understand blame avoidance behavior, to understand credit claiming behavior when one occurs and not the other. And there is an emerging and sort of long literature, or large literature, that's starting to deal with those issues. This particular issue of the long term, I think, represents a rather sizable gap in the literature. You can speculate on why that's the case. In some jurisdictions, for instance, the focus is really exclusively on short-term firefighting type policy making, often caused by, for instance, very short electoral cycles and activities like that. This is the case, I think, in Australia, for instance, a little bit in the US and elsewhere. But the long-term issues which really transcend those electoral cycles and others have been largely ignored. Some of you may know the work of people like Paul Pearson, obviously, who started to look at these longer-term processes. My colleague Alan Jacobs at UBC, of course, has worked on long-term policy processes, comparing the development of pension policies, for instance, in multiple countries over the last 100 years or so. I used to work almost exclusively on natural resource issues and forestry issues, and in many of those issues, of course, you're dealing with very long-term policies. So if you're trying to replant forests in climates like this one, you're looking at 75 to 100-year rotation periods, and there is a need to understand those long-term processes, I think, better than has been done to date in the literature. The problem, I think, as we've sort of identified it here, is this problem about synchronization. So it's this problem about trying to maintain or retain or alter and maintain the original match between content and context which characterized the policy. So assuming that you have a successful policy at the outset, that usually means that context and content have been matched. However, what happens when the content is changing and the context is changing? Does the content change along with the context? And very often the answer is no. So this leads to this issue about this lack of a match between context and content, or this lack of synchronization as being a potential cause of this propensity for longer-term policies to fail, and for policies simply, even if they are designed in the short term, if they're left in place and are not altered, to fail. So we think that this is potentially an interesting and useful concept. A lot of the discussion, as I mentioned, at this next conference in Chengdu is going to be about issues like agility and synchronization and the like. Okay. In order to sort of pursue that research agenda and to have a little bit more clarity on some of the processes that are involved here, it's necessary, I think, to think about what it means to be adaptive and what it means to be flexible. You probably know already that in some areas there's a fairly large literature on adaptive policymaking, which has been developed over the past 10 years or so. That's true, again, in issues like climate change, for instance, but also in other areas, a lot of them, though, dealing with the environment. We think that this is a very useful approach, which is useful beyond just the environmental context or the climate change context. We think that most of those principles apply across the board, whether it's in the area of economic policy or social policy or others, as well as with environmental policy. And one of the issues here then becomes, well, what does it mean to be adaptive? What are you adapting to? And is it the case that we can have, in conditions of uncertainty, the ability to design this requisite level of adaptation into the policy right at the outset? Or is it also necessary to have an adaptive policy process which enables the adaptation to occur over time? Most of the literature on environmental policy and on climate change policy tends to focus on adaptation at the outset in the policy itself. So if you're thinking about something like market-based solutions to global warming issues, when you think about things like carbon markets and things like that, as opposed to, say, carbon taxes or regulation, part of the idea of why a carbon market would be superior to a regulatory approach is that it itself is flexible and adaptive, and so that the policy itself is able to change over time to take into account some of the shifts that will occur in the environment, hopefully as the emissions trading system, whatever, becomes more successful. Right? So you don't have to keep recalibrating the costs of carbon emissions. Rather, it is a market mechanism, and the market mechanism itself should change to reflect shifts in carbon emissions over time as the policy itself takes effect. However, there is also an issue about policy processes. And is it necessary, or should also the policy processes themselves be adaptive? Some of you may recall an older book by Charles Lindblom, and a co-author on the subject, but who talked about the intelligence of democracy. And one of the arguments about democracy, of course, is that democracy is an adaptive policy process in itself. So you don't know what the actual content is that the policy process will deal with, but you do know, because of periodic elections and rotations of elites and others in office, that the process itself is adaptive and flexible. One of the questions that we're interested in is this policy design at the outset in terms of the content versus the policy design as a process in itself. We think that in order to be effective and adaptive, it is usually the case over the long term that the process has to be adaptive and not just the policy. And in fact, I would probably argue, if it's going to be one or the other, you really want an adaptive process rather than an adaptive policy. So that's where this paper goes, and it's a discussion about why this is the case and why, in certain conditions, simply having an adaptive policy content at the outset is probably not enough, and that you really do need this additional process dimension, the flexibility that an adaptive process gives you in order to deal with shifts in the context of policy as these occur over relatively long periods of time. And by relatively long periods of time, I'm talking about really anything from, say, 10 years to 100 years or so. Okay, a concept which is useful, I think, in sort of deriving that argument and justifying that argument has to do with dealing with the distinction that's drawn very often between ambiguity and uncertainty in policymaking. As I mentioned, Walker and his colleagues have sort of continued to think about this and to develop this in a number of different contexts. Again, many of them on the environment. Some of the work that they're doing now, some of you may know, is a large-scale project dealing with water policy issues in the Mekong River. And so they have an empirical basis for this. But as I said, I'm not really going to be talking about that. I'm just going to be talking about the concepts that are involved. Okay, so just to sort of look a little bit then at this ambiguity versus uncertainty issue and see how it relates to the need for agility or flexibility, and then also the type of agility or flexibility which is required, we'll just say sort of a few words about that. The general problem, of course, is the one that I mentioned of synchronicity, right? There's a number of different aspects of policy making which change and which change over time, and which are not necessarily linked to the policy itself. So the impact of the policy can change over time, the nature of the output can change over time, especially the target behavior, that is the nature of those who are affected by the policy, can change over time. And what those changes are usually uncertain. They're happening at some point in the future. Nobody, of course, as Herbert Simon noted for us, can predict the future, much though they may claim to do so. So these are really fundamentally uncertain processes. There are risks involved in them, and of course, modern governments and policymakers and others spend a great deal of time and money and effort and personnel dealing with risk and risk management, and have different kinds of techniques for risk assessment and others, in order to try to make the uncertain a little less uncertain and to make it a little bit more certain, hopefully, in terms of what will happen in some of these elements of policy over time. The problem is, of course, the one that I mentioned a moment ago, which is that even if the policy is developed and is effective in the short term, over time, these elements or components that went into the risk assessment at the beginning may change, and of course do change in many instances. So the problem is that even if you are, and if you do have sort of effective risk management activities, in some policy areas, the outcomes are extremely uncertain. It's very difficult to quantitatively assess them. Or even where you are able to do that, the changes may occur in the impacts and target behavior and so on in the context of the policy, which means that the original assessments are incorrect or are no longer operable, as they say. One of the ways, I think, which is useful at getting a handle on this particular kind of problem, that is this problem of dealing with uncertainty over the medium to long term, is to try to be more precise about the nature of the uncertainties and the nature of the context in which policymaking takes place. We think failing to correctly identify the bounds and range of uncertainties is a major cause of policy failure. Some of you may know the work of Moshe Mayor in Israel, who's published a fair amount recently on policy bubbles, meaning policy over and under reaction on the part of government. The notion that we have been interested in some of the conferences that we've done, talking about over and under design of policies. And in Mayor's work and others, failing to identify these range of uncertainties accurately, it causes over and under reactions and over under designs, which in themselves are causes of policy failures. So a useful thing to do is to try to think a little bit more about the nature of uncertainty, about the distinction between uncertainty and ambiguity that you will see in the literature, and to come up with really a better classification system for uncertainty and ambiguity that can be linked to very practical recommendations for particular kinds of policies and policy processes that can deal with the class of uncertainty that they have to deal with. There is a little bit of literature on that in Walker's work and others, and I just want to run through a little bit of that now so you can see where this concept of deep uncertainty comes from. Sorry, you can't see that one too well. Some of you may know, especially in the economics literature, the notion about Knightian uncertainty, which of course comes from some early work in the 1920s. In economics, it's kind of foundational work, which is often forgotten, but was important anyway, in the history of the discipline, which was trying to get a handle on risk and on different kinds of uncertainty. And one of the distinctions that Knight drew in his work was between difficulties of parameter estimates versus difficulties when the actual equations themselves either can't be formulated or are unknown. Right? So this provides two different notions of risk and two different ways of thinking about risk and how risk can be managed. So in the case of so-called Knightian risk, right, the idea is that it is possible to think of a kind of production function, or to think of, it doesn't have to be a quantitative measure, but to think of a set of causal relationships in which the risk is really in identifying the parameters of the variables that are involved in that, in some cases, in the quantitative case, equations, or in the variables that are involved in the causal relationship that you're suggesting. So, if you think that something like presence of drugs plus lack of housing plus lack of income leads to homelessness, so you have three basic variables there, and the risk aspect is really, well, how much, right? So, how much money is missing, how much money is needed, in the case of, say, the drug use, what kinds of drugs are being used, can these be controlled, and so on. But the fundamental sort of equation, the fundamental thinking about the problem and the solution is already established or accepted. So the risk is really the risk involved in making a mistake about the parameters. So this is a less fundamental kind of risk than the situation where you're wrong about the equation. So there's actually maybe 3 or 4 additional variables that you haven't considered or you haven't thought about. Or you're completely wrong. It's a genetic issue. It has nothing to do with these variables that you've identified. You made a fundamental mistake in thinking about and conceptualizing the problem. So for Knight, this led to a distinction between what economists now like to call Knightian risk and Knightian uncertainty, right? So the Knightian risk is a relatively shallow kind of uncertainty, and by that I don't mean that it's unimportant, but it's a limited kind of uncertainty as opposed to Knightian uncertainty, which is a much more fundamental kind of ambiguity, right? It is really, you can think of it actually as a mistake to think of it as uncertainty because it is really a profound uncertainty. And that's something that Walker and others like to call deep uncertainty. It's largely the same distinction that's being made. When you apply this, and I want to talk a little bit more about the application to policy in a second, but when you apply this to some aspects of policy making, I think you can see the significance of those distinctions and of that kind of distinction. Many of you probably know Morgan and Henrien's work from 1990 on uncertainty, and which is the kind of text in the policy field dealing with the issue because it specifically focuses on policy questions and the impacts of uncertainty on policy questions. Well, Morgan and Henrien's book tends to look mainly at so-called shallow uncertainty, right? They're looking at what are the problems that are involved when certain aspects of the parameter estimates for hypothetical relationships or causal expectations are missing. So they look at concerns about uncertainty that have to do with some of these factors like the ones that are listed here. So there's 7 of them, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but hopefully you can see them. They're concerned about things like imprecision, right? They're concerned about random statistical events that may not be properly encapsulated in the relationships between the variables or the parameters. In other words, if there's a nonlinear relationship where there's a linear relationship which is expected. They're concerned about subjective judgment. They're concerned about disagreements between experts, but they're really dealing with these parameter estimates, right? So relatively shallow uncertainty. This again doesn't mean that these aren't important, and to a certain extent, much of the debate and discussion and dialogue and discourse which occurs in policymaking processes occurs around those concerns, right? I'm sure you all have examples from the kinds of works that you do and the cases that you're looking at where this kind of debate has occurred. What kind of a subsidy should be provided to a manufacturer in order to get them to locate in a high unemployment area of the country? That involves judgments about business behavior, about the nature of the amount of the subsidy, the reaction to the subsidy, the kind of subsidy that's provided, and experts and others will disagree on those aspects. So a lot of policymaking goes on dealing with this kind of uncertainty. And this is all very important and is the really, as you all know, is sort of the meat and potatoes of policymaking. However, the problem is that it really leaves out this more fundamental deep uncertainty or ambiguity. It's kind of fundamental ambiguity. And I think that's captured in this one figure that Morgan and Henry provide in their work. You'll note right at the top, they're talking about uncertainty, and they talk about a distinction between quantity types and model forms. Well, that's really the distinction between shallow and deep uncertainty. Right? That's really the distinction between kind of parameter Knightian risk and more Knightian uncertainty or ambiguity. And you'll note that most of what's in the book, and this is, if you've looked at the book, you'll know this is kind of an organizing chart that they provide. Most of the discussion, almost all of the discussion, is about Knightian risk. Right? It's about the shallow uncertainty. So all of the boxes in that organizational chart or flow chart, whatever you want to call it, are really dealing with quantity types. Right? They're all subtypes talking about how to be more precise, how to overcome problems dealing with certain kinds of risk and uncertainty, but which are linked to these parameter estimates for known models and known or agreed upon equations. The model form, which is the one at the top with the little orange arrow there, you'll note isn't linked to anything because they don't really talk about this in their book. And this is what I think drew us to this discussion, was to try to think a little bit more about that particular kind of deep uncertainty or ambiguity which is and exists beyond these parameter estimates. As I mentioned before, the reason for that is because we think over time most of the discussion is really about the model form and not about the parameter estimates. So in the short term, you may be dealing with parameter estimates. In the longer term, you're probably dealing with concerns about the accuracy of the original models that went into the process. In some cases, again, this is because you've been successful, right? So you may have set up a policy in order to deal with a particular problem. You've done your estimates, you've got improved information and so on, you have a reasonably accurate assessment of the situation, you've put the policy in place, but then something changes, right? World financial crisis, various kinds of international events, domestic situations, whatever it happens to be, where your original estimates, your original models may not be valid or accurate anymore. So how do we think about that second type of uncertainty, that second type of ambiguity? Yeah. Yeah, that's the idea. It's really a different type of uncertainty. We'll get into a question about whether there's a kind of spectrum of uncertainty or whether it's really a different type, but ultimately a different type. One of the ways that you can think about these things, and this is one of the arguments we're making, is that if you're dealing with a situation over the long term, the assumption is that it's almost automatically the case that this will be a situation of deep uncertainty. So one of the ways that you can identify a problem area in terms of which kind of uncertainty it is has to do with the time frame or horizon that's involved with it. So something that's just very short term, has a 5-year time horizon, is probably more likely to be dealing with the kind of shallow uncertainty than something where you're planning pension payments 100 years down the line. And so on. You can still see, though, if you go back to some of the items that they mention here and some of the other ones, that some of the identification that can happen as well is because you're dealing with an accepted causal mechanism, but you know that what the uncertainty is not so much with the causal mechanism, but with the parameters of that. So how many people are there in the case of, well, let's not do a pendulum, but in the short term, if it was, say, the example of the locational subsidy that I mentioned, how many firms are you dealing with? What's the potential number of firms that you can locate there? What kinds of firms are they? Those are important questions, but they're not calling into question the nature of the subsidy scheme or the fact that you think that a subsidy of a certain kind will be effective. So you already know that the uncertainty is a relatively narrow kind. And some of that you can address, you know, through marketing, through better surveys, just through better information sort of process. Okay, so what we're concerned about, though, is really this deeper uncertainty, which is really beyond this uncertainty that arises from a lack of information or a lack of precision, but which really transcends that. This has been noted in the literature before in various bits and pieces in different places. Schrader, for instance, had a working paper in 1993 where he talked about this differentiation between uncertainty and ambiguity that I mentioned before, where uncertainty is really this Knightian risk, shallow uncertainty. Ambiguity, on the other hand, involves this lack of clarity, not just on the parameters of the variables, but on the variables themselves and their relationships. So Schrader and others have argued strongly that it's important to differentiate these two types of uncertainty. They are not interested, obviously you can see here, in some kind of a spectrum arrangement, but they think that there really is a fundamental difference between shallow and deep uncertainty, or between uncertainty and ambiguity. And they have looked at this in terms of these two dimensions and how these two dimensions intersect in order to provide a number of, a relatively small number, but of distinct problem contexts characterized by the amount of uncertainty and the amount of ambiguity that exists in each circumstance. I mentioned Herbert Simon a moment ago, and most of you, I hope, are very familiar with his work, and you'll recall, of course, that he had a very famous discussion about the nature of problems and distinguish between well-structured problems and unstructured problems. This kind of matrix is largely doing the same thing, and you can sort of map some of Simon's distinctions onto this matrix. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, this is where, for Schrader, uncertainty is low, ambiguity is low. In other words, there's confidence in the model. There's also confidence in the estimates of the parameters. This is what Simon would have called a well-structured problem. And well-structured problems for policymakers generally are not all that problematic. In fact, some of my Dutch colleagues have argued that well-structured problems are really not policy problems, because the solutions to them are usually well known, the causes to them are well known, so there really are kind of standard, matter-of-fact sorts of activities that don't require very much in the way of deliberation or new thinking or new information gathering or anything like that. On the bottom right-hand side, though, of course, is the exact opposite, which is where not only is uncertainty high, so not only are the parameter estimates uncertain or unknown, but where the ambiguity is very high. That is where this deep, uncertainty is very high. This is what Simon would have called, of course, an unstructured problem, or an unstructured problem context. I'm not wild about the terms dealing with wicked problems and non-wicked problems and super wicked problems and so on, but I'm sure most of you have looked at that literature. If I have time, I'll sort of explain why I'm not all that keen on that language. But anyway, you could, again, sort of map that same discussion from Rittel and others onto this, right? So the bottom right-hand side is really the wicked problem, or what Kishore and others like to call super wicked problems. The top left-hand side is the non-wicked problem, right? The reasonably well-structured and well-understood situation. The interesting aspect of Schrader's work and others, of course, and which is different from the wicked problem discussion, is arguing that there's more than just these two types. So there are other possibilities, right, where ambiguity can be high, but uncertainty is low, and of course where uncertainty can be high and ambiguity low. This is, I think, quite a useful way to go about looking at these problem contexts in dealing with issues about design and synchronicity and so on over the long term, because it sets up a taxonomy or a classification system for problems that you can map onto the extent to which any solution developed or implemented to deal with that kind of problem must be adaptive or flexible. So the argument is that in the relatively well-structured situation, we're very often looking at relatively short-term solutions. Otherwise, the ambiguity would be much higher. And in those situations, you will have a different kind of design and a different kind of design process, or you should have anyway, than when you're dealing with the other categories, and especially the sort of ultimate category of the high uncertainty, high ambiguity problem. I made this distinction a moment ago about flexibility and agility in policies as opposed to flexibility and agility in processes. Well, as you move towards that right-hand bottom quadrant, I think that's where you're dealing with the need for both flexibility in the policy and also flexibility in the process itself. And a lot of times, of course, this doesn't happen, which we argue is a relatively common source of policy failure. In other words, if you misdiagnose the situation, so if you act as if the bottom right-hand side is actually the top left-hand side, you will probably design a relatively short-term policy, which is not particularly flexible or adaptive, and as the context changes over time, it will probably fail. It will have a higher propensity to fail, a much higher likelihood to fail. I would go all the way. I would say it will fail, and it's just a matter of when. Other people would argue that it could maintain itself for some time, but I don't think that's the case. Okay. There are others who have made a similar kind of analysis, who have done so a little bit more recently. So there are some references in here, if anybody who's interested, like Quackel's work in 2010, Brugnach and others in 2008, who have also been working with this ambiguity uncertainty distinction. The overall distinction is very much the same. It's the same kind of distinction that Knight made back in 1920. It's this distinction between ambiguity and uncertainty, which is sometimes linked, as in Brugnach's case, to sort of knowledge issues, talking about ontological lacks or uncertainties as opposed to epistemic risk and such. But they're really all talking about very much the same thing, which is different categories of problems, looking at the context of the problem in terms of this distinction between ambiguity and uncertainty. I mentioned Walker and his colleagues, and they have been working in this area, and I'll mention that work in a second because I think it's very appropriate and useful. But there are others, and I don't want to get into a lot of discussion about this, but you may, of course, recall some of the famous distinctions made by people like Donald Rumsfeld and others in the US, talking about known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and so on. Well, in a not particularly articulate way, if any of you have seen Errol Morris's documentary on Rumsfeld, you'll know that he actually gets this wrong in the documentary and contradicts himself, but in any event, this discussion about known knowns and known unknowns and so on is getting at the same issue, right? It's getting at these questions about what is relatively certain in the short term, what is uncertain, what is really fundamentally unknown or difficult to know in the longer term. So I think looking at ambiguity and uncertainty in the way that these authors have is quite useful, is often done by practitioners, although not necessarily in a sort of conscious way, but they are all dealing with these same issues, and they all realize the significance of these issues in terms of policy designs, in terms of successes and failures, in terms of the nature of learning, the kinds of activities that should take place in order to design more effective, that is, policies which are more likely to succeed and to continue to succeed over the long term. So it's not a purely academic discussion. I think both the practitioners and academics want more precision and to understand a little bit better what these different risk characteristics are, because they both have the same goal in mind, which is ultimately to have more efficient, more effective, more successful policies. Okay, Walker and his colleagues have identified a number of different situations. That is, they're more precise about the nature of these different contexts which are linked to these different patterns or relationships between uncertainty and ambiguity, or between shallow and deep uncertainty. In their work, they generally don't talk about ambiguity so much. They talk about deep uncertainty. That, again, I think sort of implies that they're thinking about this as a kind of linear relationship, but I don't think that's true. I think they really are thinking about, it's not necessarily nonlinear, but just different fundamental categories, which they call in some of their work, and they've done quite a bit of this, sort of level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4 contexts or problems. These are, I think you can see, and this is just from one of the pieces that they've published in 2010, I think you can see that they're talking about the same kinds of contexts that we referred to earlier. So level 1 is very much on the shallow uncertainty, the Knightian risk side, in which there's a relatively clear enough future, whatever that means. It's relatively not all that complex, so single systems involved. There are estimates of, again, what some of the parameters are that have to be impacted or affected by policy interventions. And the policymakers are usually able to agree on some notion of what the weights of the different variables and the parameters are. So level 1 is very much the sort of structured problem context we talked about before. And then these other types are variations as the level of what I'm calling ambiguity increases to what Walker and his colleagues argue is a level 4 situation of deep uncertainty. So in level 2, again, you're dealing with alternate possibilities for alternate futures or scenarios based on different estimates that are provided for the parameters in the variables that you're focusing on. So there are a number of different alternate futures. It may not be clear which of those futures is better, which is more likely to occur. So you may have, of course, additional dialogue and discussion that you wouldn't have in a level 1 situation around those parameters. But really, both level 1 and level 2 are dealing with that Knightian risk shallow uncertainty sign. Then, of course, you have level 3 and 4 that they characterize as being scenarios of deep uncertainty, in which in level 3, there's not only a number of different possible alternatives, but really a multiplicity of alternative future frames. That is, there's not just sort of one equation in which you're dealing with different possible parameters, but you're dealing with different possible equations with different parameters. And then ultimately level 4, which is very much the Simon unstructured problem, the wicked problem context, in which the future is really unknown, and it's very difficult to even know whether the equations, if you look at it that way, that you're using are accurate or not. So as I said, this is sometimes seen as a kind of spectrum of uncertainty and ambiguity, but I think it really is more of a taxonomical or categorical scheme, recognizing different types of problem contexts within the shallow uncertainty arena, and then different types of context in the deep uncertainty arena. And this is useful because of some of the, not really parameters, but some of the dimensions of the problem that they identify and develop in their work. One of the reasons that I think this work is very good and very interesting is because they don't just leave it at that. So in the sense of those of you who've looked at the wicked problem literature will know that the authors like Churchman and others say that there are wicked problems and presumably non-wicked problems, but then don't say anything about what you actually would do about that. The Knightian risk versus Knightian uncertainty discussion, again, says the same thing, that there are problems. It doesn't really give you an idea of how to deal with that. Morgan and Granger, obviously, just talk about the distinction, but don't really develop it. But Walker and his colleagues do think about